got you looking the part, let's look at the next step, which is the first impression that you make on the interviewer. As you know, I've said previously, whether for right or wrong, conscious or subconscious, your first impression will dictate the way the interview goes. Now, obviously, I don't want you to feel too pressured by it, and in the rare occasion that your first impression or the first interaction doesn't go as planned, don't worry, you can still recover it, but it's just a nice way to set the tone. Remember, for the panel interview or an online interview, you may only have to do this once, but for MMIs, you're going to have to do that potentially 8 times. So it's important to practice it and make sure that it's something that's on autopilot that you're not worrying about. So, other than appearance, which is what we discussed in the previous video, there are 3 other elements that are going to dictate how you come across in your first impression. Now, those are how you enter the room, how you greet the panel, kind of also including whether you shake their hand or not, which we'll come on to discuss. And finally, the body language that you portray. And remember, this is probably going to be your first and certainly most likely to be one of your most important interviews. So it's important that we do as much as we can ahead of time to prepare you and get you as ready for this as possible. One of the most important things that kind of comes under entering the room is actually entering the room on time. So it's a silly, obvious bit of advice, but God knows how many people I've seen at interview who arrived through the door so panicked and stressed because they've left, they didn't plan, they didn't allow enough time, and they've arrived late to the interview. Now, if you're running late, the best case scenario is that you still arrive just about on time, but you'll be incredibly flustered and not in the right mind frame to be doing one of the most important interviews of your life. But at the worst case scenario, they may have no time to fit you in, they might have to reschedule you, and may say if it's late in the interview period, they might not be able to fit you in at all. So let's just avoid any problems like that and make sure that we allow plenty of time. That includes planning the route ahead of the journey. It also means getting there, planning to get there half an hour early, so that, because a lot of these interviews are held in hospitals or universities, which have big, confusing campuses, that you do need a bit of time to at least identify the room or the place that you need to go to register ahead of time. And then, once you've identified where that is, you can go off and get a coffee or go and compose yourself somewhere, but at least you've catered for every variability and you've controlled the situation as much as you can, which will ultimately put you at ease. I was certainly nervous for my interview, and nerves are clearly a well-expected and understood part of this process. But that said, try and keep yourself as calm as possible. Try and learn some techniques like deep breathing or meditation that will help you remain calm when you're under fire. Interviewers will be sympathetic to the fact that you will be a little bit nervous, and understandably so. But don't worry too much, because remember, nerves is a balance. There's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, or the Yerkes-Dodson graph, that you may have seen, where stress and performance are actually interlinked. Now, up to a point, the more aroused or stressed you are, the better your performance, because you're alert and you take it seriously. But obviously there's a peak of that, and then beyond that, any more stress starts to hinder performance. So don't worry if you're a bit nervous, try and channel it, because in that Yerkes-Dodson equation, the peak of stress versus performance is the area that they call the zone. So if you can get yourself into the zone, then obviously that is where you'll perform your best. But just remember, of course, that one of the reasons that you're interviewing is to show that you have the skills to be a good doctor. And one of those skills is to be able to hold your nerve under pressure. So it's important to not get too nervous and do whatever you can to control it and bring it into that kind of right window for maximum performance. And you may have seen me talk about this in other videos. I'm quite a big fan of this technique. It's something that I learned from Tim Ferriss, who's a podcaster. And he recommends to rehearse the conditions for the test as much as possible, or for this case, the interview. Now, what he says is that you should put yourself in situations that will replicate the kind of nervousness or the environment as much as possible. So he will recommend things like going and running up and down stairs for a few minutes so that you get your heart racing, so that you replicate that nervous heart racing moment, heart pounding moment that you'll get in front of the interview panel. And then sit down with some people and practice some questions, practice holding your nerve even though your heart's racing. He also recommends things like try and do your practice at the same time that your interview is going to be, so that your body clock is well adjusted to performing at that time, and you kind of are used to having to deliver at a certain time of day. So now let's look at what you do when you actually enter the room or enter the situation. I would say that my most important piece of body language advice is to smile. Smiling has so many benefits in situations like this. When you smile, it sends a signal to your brain that says everything's okay. It will also help you relax into the situation and put yourself at ease. Not only that, it will put the other interviewers at ease as well. If you're relaxed, they will respond to that and they will be relaxed as well. If you're smiling and you're an amenable person, it may well also make the interviewers more amenable to you, and that helps you control the environment, control the situation, and ultimately guide the interview towards your favor. And dare I say it, try and enjoy it. Remember, this interview is basically, without being too arrogant, is your opportunity to tell everybody how great you are. So enjoy it. This is you talking about all the great things you've done and like all the positive impact that you've had on the world. So yeah, take it into your stride and just really have fun with it. You know, it's there to, the more you relax, the better it will go, the more natural it will flow. So if you can just relax and try and enjoy it, it will definitely go more in your favor than if you didn't. So as you walk into the room, remember, you're putting on a performance. So channel that person in you that is one day going to be a great doctor. It's not asking you to lie. It's not asking you to be someone that you're not. It's just asking you to be that version of yourself that is a professional, that has what it takes to one day go on and be a fantastic doctor. So as you walk into that room, act the part, walk confidently, go in, smile, and look at every single person directly in the eye, smile at them each individually, and say hello to them. Shaking hands is a bit of a tricky area. Now, it's something that can happen quite naturally, but lately, of course, has been sidelined slightly. Whilst it's true that I do see doctors bumping elbows with each other, I just think in an interview, there's no real place for it. Regardless of what's going on, my advice is this. Basically, just be receptive to the situation. It's unlikely after COVID that interviewers will shake your hand, but just be receptive and be prepared for them to offer an elbow or a hand. I would say do this. Walk in expecting not to shake hands, being prepared for if they do offer you a hand or an elbow, but just walk to them, stand in front of them with respecting their personal space, of course. Look them all in the eye, smile and say, hello, my name's Ashley, nice to meet you. Then the next thing is going to happen that they will either offer you a hand or an elbow, or they will just offer you a seat. And at that point, say thank you and just sit down confidently. And then at that point, you take a moment, you take a deep breath, you compose yourself, and you smile at everybody again. Now, I will talk briefly about what makes a good handshake. Now, with a handshake, do not confuse firm with an excessively strong or squeezing really hard handshake. A firm handshake, I've always been told, is where you create tension within the knuckles from side to side. Now, that means that when they shake your hand, it's firm and hard to squeeze together, but it's not you squeezing their hand to death. The firmness and the strength in a good handshake comes from you having a good grip that can't be compressed. So remember that rather than trying to squeeze the life out of their hands. Now let's look a little bit about body language and how to sit. In my view, there's really only one appropriate seated position for an interview. Sat down, legs uncrossed, feet square on the floor, sat upright, shoulders back and length slightly forward beyond 90 degrees. You can either place your hands on your lap or cup them in your lap. If you're someone who's prone to fidgeting with their hands, I always think taking a folder or a record of achievements so that you can hold on to so that you don't actually fidget with your hands whilst you're talking. There's only one other position that I think is appropriate to interview, and that's that of leaning in. Now, but this is usually during MMI stations in the role play type questions or type scenarios, where you're leaning in to kind of show empathy or to connect with the patient. Any other time, I think it still doesn't quite seem professional. But used appropriately in the right role play scenario, I think it shows a lot of empathy. So here are 3 sitting positions that I would try and avoid at all costs. The first one is cross-legged, because it basically just comes across as too casual or slightly arrogant. If you're slouched, it comes across as that you're uninterested. And also, sitting on your hands, it's good to avoid fidgeting, but I think it appears slightly childish, to be honest. Another thing to be aware of is over gesticulating with your hands. Some people tend to talk with their hands and it can be very distracting. So try not to fidget too much. And like I say, either hold them in your lap or cut them. You can use the occasional hand gesture, but when you're nervous and you're talking a lot, you might not realize just how much you are using your hands. And I'll give you a tip coming up as to how to make sure you don't do too much of that. Another thing that can be quite distracting or off-putting is verbal tics. These are filler words like, you know, because you can imagine an interview that you've seen in the past of maybe a footballer who is using filler words every other word, and you can imagine the sort of impression that that gives. Think of how that makes them come across and the impression that it leaves on you. Well, that's exactly the impression that you would leave on the panel if you were using the same sort of filler words. So be on the lookout, not necessarily just for filler words, but nervous words or sayings that you say a lot. People say things such as, well, basically or essentially, lots and lots of times. These are those little things that if you're on the lookout for them, you can eliminate them and you can work on that early on to make sure that they're gotten rid of by the time that you actually come to interview. And that's exactly what brings me on to my final tip as to how you can avoid these annoying habits. And that is to get a second pair of eyes on you. Whether that's someone that you're practicing the interview with or someone who's observing you, or really the best thing is getting a camera and seeing it for yourself. If you record yourself on your camera phone and then watch it back, you are undeniably doing these things that are annoying. Someone telling you that you're doing them might not necessarily register, but when you see it on camera and you see for yourself just how off-putting it is, that will really hit home and make you strive to cut it out. Another good trick is actually that a lot of actors do is to watch the footage back on mute, because you can tell a lot about how someone's communicating. Do you really believe what they're saying? Are they gesticulating too much and talking too fast so that you can't understand them because you can clearly tell that they're nervous? Things like that are things that will give you away. So watching yourself back on video, watching yourself on mute will help you identify those. So a few tips for you and a lot to think about and a lot to work on, but something to bear in mind as we go through the rest of these videos throughout this course. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.